It happened in February 2014. A huge meteorite was flying toward Earth, intending to destroy all life on the planet. An amateur astronomer was the first to discover it. His name was Joe. He was one of those guys who, at 30, still lived with his mother, had a modest income that suited him just fine, and a large belly from a sedentary lifestyle. He worked at the local 24-hour convenience store. He didn't have any friends, but he had a passion for studying space, inherited from his father, who left the family when Joe was 7. On the evening when his father said goodbye to him, he gave Joe a cap with his favorite team's logo and a small, cheap telescope. Joe didn't get into sports, but he did fall in love with astronomy. Every evening he would sit on the roof and watch the stars, sometimes cursing the clouds that blocked his view at the wrong moments. On that ill-fated day, the Super Bowl was taking place, and the entire country was glued to their TV screens. But Joe was not interested in this event. He came home from his shift, changed clothes, brewed some hot coffee, and leisurely climbed to the roof, where he had his mini observatory. It was cold outside, but he dressed warmly and set up a small portable heater next to him. Humming a silly song to himself, he sat on the couch and peered through the telescope's eyepiece. "So, what do we have today?" he said, looking into the lens. These words would become legendary in the future and turn into memes, but he didn't know that then. At that moment, the sky was clear, and Joe was pleased that the clouds wouldn't obstruct his view. But suddenly, his hands began to tremble, and he fearfully uttered, "What is that?" He nervously rubbed his eyes, and then looked through the eyepiece again. As he stared at something, he fearfully muttered to himself, "It can't be, it just can't be." Then he jumped up, started running around the roof, panicking and shouting, "We're all going to die!" Thousands of thoughts raced through his mind. What to do? Who to call? What next? Suddenly he stopped abruptly and ran down to his bedroom. Turning on his computer, he went to the NASA website and started looking for their contacts. Finally finding them, Joe grabbed the phone and dialed the number. The phone rang over and over, but no one answered. Damn it, what are they doing over there? He kept calling, but it was in vain. Then he dialed his acquaintance, a professor who worked at the local university. A disgruntled voice answered on the other end of the line. "Hello? I'm listening." "David, we're doomed. A meteorite is heading for Earth." "What do you mean?" the professor asked. Joe quickly told him all the details. The professor didn't believe him at first, as he was following the game and his mind was elsewhere. But Joe's persistence and frightened voice alarmed the scientist, and he decided to check the sky. For this, he went to the university observatory, and when he looked through the telescope's eyepiece, he almost fainted. From that moment, the wheel of panic began to spin. The news spread like wildfire. One scientist after another confirmed the discovery. This information leaked to the media, and people who had been joyfully watching the main game of the year the day before were now nervously, and some in panic, following any news. At this time, the government convened an emergency conference, and scientists began making calculations, reluctant to announce the impending end of the world until the last moment. The meteorite's size was catastrophic, about 10 kilometers in diameter. They couldn't hide the truth for long, and the information came out. This period was later called the 3 days of worldwide panic. I won't go into detail about what happened then, but briefly, there was complete anarchy. It was the end for humanity. Everyone took the news differently. Some gathered with family, some committed suicide, and some did things they had long postponed. Churches were packed, and the number of atheists sharply decreased. Everyone was seeking salvation and hope. I was 10 years old at the time, and I remember this moment. My father was an extraordinary and upbeat person. He just said we should celebrate the news. He set up a table in the backyard and started grilling. My sister, who was 7 at the time, and I were happily running around the garden, throwing snowballs and building a snowman. We didn't notice that our mother was very nervous. It was harder for her to accept the fact that death was near. But my father entertained everyone as best he could, and the tension eased a bit. Soon night fell. The 4 of us were sitting on the couch that my father had brought out onto the porch from the house, watching the sky. It was bright from the approaching celestial body. We were mesmerized by this deadly beauty. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, someone screamed, someone cried, and gunshots could be heard. The end was near. But suddenly, the meteorite changed its trajectory, sharply turning to the left. It left behind a long, bright trail. It seemed to consist of several materials that chipped off, creating colorful light streaks. It was truly an impressive sight. Suddenly, we heard joyful crying. It was our neighbor, who was sitting behind the fence, watching the sky just like us. Humanity got lucky. Somehow, the meteorite changed its flight path. Scientists around the world racked their brains over how this happened. Everyone understood that by all laws of physics, it should have fallen to Earth. Something influenced it, but what? Speculations and theories quickly emerged. Some said it was the Russians, others said aliens. Gradually, everyone realized it wasn't the end, and there was universal jubilation. Celebrations were held in every country, but soon life returned to normal. The unrest was quelled, and the damage was assessed. Questions were also raised about why scientists, whose work had cost billions of dollars, missed a meteorite that threatened the extinction of all life on the planet. In their defense, the scientists showed scan results of that part of the sky, insisting that this celestial object appeared out of nowhere. This became another mystery that troubled people's minds. During the investigation, journalists identified the person who first discovered the approaching threat. Joe immediately became popular, and his story and quotes spread worldwide. He was frequently on TV and participated in various shows. But then he suddenly disappeared. Where he is now and what he is doing, no one knows. So it seemed the threat had passed, and humanity managed to relax. But exactly 1 month later, on March 2nd, news came that shocked everyone again. In Yellowstone National Park, there is a small, little-known valley called Ghost Valley. This place is in the northeastern part of the park, near the Lamar Valley area, known for its wildlife and scenic landscapes. A hunter discovered an unknown anomaly there. His attention was drawn to a strange flicker on the horizon. He squinted, trying to make out what it was. The closer he got, the clearer it became. Around the valley stood an invisible barrier, barely noticeable, like a mirage in the desert. He decided to go through it and found himself in a vast, dark forest where night reigned. Terrified, he returned, and it became day again. It turned out that the barrier was a portal to an unknown world. This news quickly spread around the world, shocking the planet's inhabitants. No one knew what this anomaly was. The government quickly cordoned off the area, turning it into a second Area 51. But it seemed that this anomaly had intelligence and began to expand to such enormous proportions that it became impossible to completely block access. People found places where they could pass unnoticed. Soon, people who had ventured into this zone and managed to return began to appear. When they gave interviews, their eyes were empty, as if they had experienced something horrific. One of them was Robert Crown. He was a 40-year-old man, an avid hunter, and a lover of all things mystical. I recently re-watched the recording where he talked about what happened to them. I was struck by his appearance. He seemed to have aged significantly, and his face showed that he had endured severe hardships. Even on camera, he did not stop drinking. He held a glass of whiskey, which trembled every time he brought it to his mouth. The reporter impatiently asked him questions, but the man was in no hurry to answer. He closed his eyes as if it was hard for him to remember, then began his story in a hoarse voice. There were 20 of us. All of us were experienced hunters, including former rangers and military personnel. We found each other on a forum dedicated to this topic. One day, one of us, named David, said he had found a path around the government forces that led straight to the barrier. We were thrilled with this news and immediately formed a team. We set off a week later, armed and fully equipped. The path was indeed unguarded, and we finally reached the barrier. Crossing it was not difficult, and we found ourselves in the forest. This forest was enormous, and I don't know if it has an end. The first thing we noticed was the sounds. They seemed no different from those in our world. But we, being experienced, immediately realized something was off. If you listened closely, there was an unfamiliar clicking noise. Soon we found the insect that made this sound. It was a beetle, covered in hair, somewhat resembling a spider, but it had 4 legs, and next to its mouth were sacs that inflated and produced that very clicking sound. One of us, named Jack Matthews, decided to touch it. We tried to stop him, but he was on a high, you understand. We were pioneers. Our eyes were full of enthusiasm, our minds full of faith in the modern man's ability to do anything. This clouded our judgment and dulled our caution. As soon as Jack reached out, the creature jumped onto his face and sprayed something from its cheeks. It was a green acid that began to burn his skin. He fell, screaming in agony. Panic erupted among us. Someone kicked the creature away, and we wanted to wash Jack's face, but it was too late. It was an instant death. The acid must have been poisoned. This incident sobered us up, and we realized we were in a dangerous place. We dragged the body to the barrier to return it to his family later, but none of us wanted to go back. Despite encountering danger less than 10 feet in, Jack's screams still echoing in our heads, we continued our journey. Now we were extremely cautious and avoided touching anything. Leaving markers to find our way back, we ventured about 5 miles deep. Along the way, we encountered unknown creatures, and we theorized that this place was not on Earth but on another planet. We confirmed this when we found a giant tree. Despite being here for a while, we had never seen the sky. There was sunlight, but the rays barely penetrated the dense foliage, so it was always twilight. At night, climbing the tree, we finally saw the starry sky. It was incredibly beautiful. Astonishingly, the stars were of different colors, and there were 2 moons. When I saw them, I nearly fell off the branch. It was so shocking. We finally fully realized we were on another planet, and it scared us. We decided to go back. Then disaster struck. As we retraced our steps, the forest suddenly filled with quiet footsteps, as if something small was moving nearby. We froze, listening. The footsteps grew louder, and we instinctively hid behind trees and bushes. From the shadows, small creatures, the size of a 5-year-old child, slowly emerged. Their skin was greenish and covered in tiny scales, their faces elongated with large noses and long, pointed ears. Their eyes glowed bright yellow, and sharp teeth gleamed in the dim light. We were shocked. Could it be that old tales had come to life? Before us stood real goblins, and judging by their appearance, they were far from friendly. These small beings moved quickly and efficiently, clearly possessing intelligence and organization. There were many of them, and they communicated with strange cries and whistles. They held small spears with sharp stone tips, making them even more dangerous. We tried to remain unnoticed, but one of the goblins suddenly turned its head in our direction and froze, staring right at us. Its eyes narrowed, and it screamed, attracting the others' attention. The goblins rushed towards us, and we had to use our weapons. Gunfire erupted, and several goblins fell, but there were too many of them. They were fast and agile, skillfully dodging our shots and attacking from different directions. We fought desperately, but the goblins advanced with incredible speed. Their spears whistled through the air, piercing our bulletproof vests and wounding our people. I saw one of our men, Mike, fall, pierced by a spear in his side. His eyes clouded over and he collapsed to the ground. I kept shooting until my ammo ran out, then grabbed a knife and engaged in close combat. The goblins surrounded us, and each of us fought to the last bullet. But there were too many of them. They attacked from all sides, their claws and teeth tearing at our comrades, and the forest filled with screams of pain and despair. I saw John, our commander, fighting off 3 goblins at once. One of them jumped on him from behind and stabbed a spear into his shoulder. John screamed but continued to fight, throwing the goblin off and stabbing it with his knife. Blood streamed down his face, but he didn't give up. In this chaotic battle, we lost many. Despite their losses, the goblins kept advancing. Their claws and teeth ripped through our comrades, and the forest filled with screams of pain and despair. Finally, realizing the battle was lost, the 3 of us who survived retreated, fending off the pursuing goblins. We ran without looking back, and, thanks to the markers we left, managed to find our way back. Returning to the barrier, we were on the verge of exhaustion but alive. We left all our equipment and hurried to the nearest populated area, deciding never to return to that cursed forest. You could see from the recording that it was difficult for him to tell this story. Robert raised his glass again and drained it to the bottom. Witnessing your comrades' deaths is not something everyone can handle. But this interview blew up the internet. It turned out that another world lay beyond the barrier, and it was dangerous. People were frightened. Immediately, many questions arose. Why did it appear? Could these creatures penetrate our world? A wave of criticism hit the government for hiding the results of the anomaly study. Under public pressure, some information was made public. First, the creatures living beyond the barrier could not penetrate our world. At least, no such cases had been recorded. Second, the barrier has a 90-day cycle. It can be entered at any time, but exiting is only possible once every 90 days. Everyone who entered and exited did so during one of these windows. Third, this world is inhabited by various fantasy creatures and monsters. The government reported many lost military and other personnel who attempted to explore this place. This information caused a furor worldwide. Could it be that the fantasy world had become a reality? Everyone, literally everyone, was discussing this news. Opinions were divided. Some preferred to completely isolate the barrier and not let anyone through, while others said it was better to know about the danger in advance and be prepared rather than live in ignorance. The government leaned towards the second option and opened access to anyone willing to share information. But few were willing to risk their lives. There were rumors that the army had been sent through the barrier with tanks and other equipment, but had been destroyed by an unknown force. Some mentioned a giant wolf. But money rules the world, and this phrase was confirmed when one of the few explorers found a mysterious flower. It was shown on all channels. It resembled a tulip and was purple, but unlike regular flowers, it glowed and emitted mysterious energy. This flower was put up for sale and bought by a billionaire who decided to eat it. And what happened next? He was cured of an incurable disease. the global media were once again abuzz. Such amazing things were hidden in this mysterious place. Immediately, the global market saw demands for these flowers, with offers reaching tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. After this, the number of explorers increased to hundreds of thousands. But this place was truly dangerous. Out of 100 people, only 10 returned. In percentage terms, this was negligible, and not all of them returned with a bounty. Only a few found such flowers, but the greed for profit killed the sense of fear. People continued to flock there in search of luck. Due to the enormous number of casualties and the missing, this area was called the Forest of Death. And the explorers who went there were called F-hunters, from Flowers Hunter. Each year more information came from this place, but many kept their findings secret and did not want to share. Therefore, much of the information appeared on the black market. After all, information is also money. But some of it still surfaced. For example, in the Forest of Death, there were places called anomalies. Stepping into such an anomaly could transport you hundreds of miles in any direction. Or you could get stuck in a disturbance like a web suspended in the air and die of hunger and dehydration. Numerous expeditions proved that it was better not to use firearms in this place. First, loud shots attracted dangerous creatures. Second, the barrier closed for 90 days, so sometimes you got stuck in this forest for 3 months and had no way to replenish your ammunition. Because of this, people returned to medieval weapons: swords, bows, spears, whatever they preferred. Many fencing and archery clubs opened around the world. I was already 12 then, and I remember my father signing me up for such training. It was the last thing he did before he went to the Forest of Death. Yes, he decided to go there because there was so much unknown. My father worked as a biologist and often went on business trips, but this time he was heading to a truly dangerous place. I remember there was a real scandal at home after he announced his intentions. My mother yelled and cried, but he was relentless. He packed his things, said goodbye to us, and left us forever. 8 years have passed, but he never returned. Whether he is alive or well, I do not know. I can't say that hard times came. My mother had a good job, and she had 2 brothers who owned a car repair shop and often helped us. Their names were Bill and Fred. One was tall and thin with blonde hair, the other short and slightly chubby with dark hair. People were often surprised to learn they were brothers because they looked so different. I often visited them, helping with work and learning their trade. 10 years have passed since the meteorite almost fell to Earth, and I'm now 24. I decided not to go to college but to start working right away. As you might have guessed, I worked for my uncles. We sent my sister to college. Everything was fine until one incident occurred. My mother was diagnosed with a rare type of cancer. This news hit us like an avalanche. I walked around in a daze for a few days, and my sister cried all the time. My mother took it more calmly. The doctors said treatment was impossible, but chemotherapy could be tried, but she refused. They gave her another year. It was a Sunday, and I was sitting on the porch talking to my uncles, who had come to visit my mother. She was the youngest in their family, and they loved her dearly and supported her in every way. We were considering options for what could be done, and only one thing came to mind: to get the Remedian flower. That's what the purple flower that cured all diseases was called. We couldn't buy it. I checked the auctions, and its minimum price started at $57 million. Even if I worked for 100 years, I wouldn't save that much. The only option left was to go to the forest ourselves and try our luck. I told my uncles my plan. Each reacted differently. Uncle Bill silently nodded while Uncle Fred shrank back in fear, dropping part of his burger. He was about to say something when a car stopped in front of the house, and a mailman got out. He walked up to us and asked if Michael Black lived here. I said that was my name, and he handed me a hefty envelope. I signed for it and he left. I was surprised. Who could have sent me a package? Opening it, I found a thick notebook. Its cover was made of roughly tanned brown leather, which had acquired a noble patina over the years. The leather was covered in fine cracks and scratches, testifying to numerous adventures and travels. In the center of the cover was an embossed ancient symbol, possibly a family crest or sign. The edges of the notebook were slightly worn, and the corners rounded from constant use. The cover closed with a leather strap that wrapped around the notebook several times, securing it reliably and neatly. Opening it, I looked at the first page. It said it belonged to Harry Black. Damn, it was my father's notebook. I cursed, and my uncles asked what it was. I began flipping through the pages and realized it was his diary. There were entries about his journey, as well as notes and sketches of creatures and plants in the forest of death. But how did it get to our world? Did it mean my father returned? Or did he send it through someone? I found no message for myself. What did it mean? We studied it for a long time, and after that, Uncle Bill said it was probably fate and our chance. They said they wouldn't let me go alone and would go with me. So we decided. We didn't tell my mother, and my sister was to stay and take care of her. Time was not on our side, so we decided to leave in 2 weeks. During this time, we needed to prepare thoroughly. I started by studying my father's diary. These entries were a treasure trove of information. Any experienced F-hunter would give everything they had for them. I even considered selling the notebook to buy the Remedian, but after some thought I realized it still wouldn't be worth that much. I also started searching the internet for information. I learned a lot of useful things. First, we needed equipment. In the modern world, with many composite materials, there was no need to make armor out of metal. We could buy special hunting armor. It was expensive, but my uncles had savings, so it wasn't a problem. We decided to order a set for each of us. Soon it arrived at the address. When we tried it on, I was genuinely excited because it was magnificent. Made from modern composite materials, it combined lightness and incredible strength. The helmet, made of carbon fiber with polymer inserts, completely covered the head, and the polycarbonate visor provided a full view and was equipped with infrared and thermal imaging sensors. The breastplate with multi-layered Kevlar and ceramic plates protected vital organs, and the cushioning foam inside absorbed impacts. Flexible shoulder and elbow plates made of carbon fiber and titanium did not restrict movement, and Kevlar gloves with reinforced inserts provided a reliable grip. The belt had pockets for ammunition and tools, and the lower part of the armor included durable pants with additional protective plates and reinforced boots. The built-in communication and navigation system, as well as sensors monitoring vital signs, complemented this high-tech equipment. We looked at ourselves in the mirror and were pleased with what we saw. We also needed to learn survival methods in this world since we could get stuck there for years. Fortunately, the internet had the necessary information, and my father's notes were helpful too. We also needed to decide on weapons. I ordered a sturdy short sword for myself. I had been practicing fencing all this time and had become quite skilled with a sword. I also ordered a bow. Uncle Bill chose a large axe, while Uncle Fred preferred a silenced pistol and a full bag of ammunition. For close combat, he chose a large dagger. We chose a time when the barrier was in its 90-day closure period, and there was still a month before it opened, so we had 4 months to get out of there. Otherwise, we would have been stuck there for 7 months. Preparation was going according to plan. The day arrived. We said goodbye to my sister, who was crying the whole time, and visited my mother, of course, not telling her anything. Then we asked a friend to drive us to Yellowstone Park. We didn't take our car, as we didn't know how long we would be stuck in the zone. The journey took half a day. Finally, we arrived. Yellowstone Park, usually filled with tourists and nature lovers, now looked like a war zone. Around the barrier was serious security. Tall metal fences with barbed wire at the top surrounded the area, creating the impression of an impregnable fortress. Watchtowers with spotlights stood at every corner of the fence. At the gates and along the fence, armed military patrols were on duty. Soldiers in full combat gear with rifles slung over their shoulders were ready for any unforeseen situation. Their faces were stern and focused, closely watching everyone who approached the barrier. Near the entrance, a temporary base had been set up. Several tents housed command posts and medical stations. Around the tents, various military vehicles could be seen. Armored personnel carriers ready for quick response in case of an emergency, and heavy trucks loaded with supplies and equipment. Drones occasionally buzzed overhead, patrolling the perimeter from above, their cameras scanning the area for threats. Mobile generators provided electricity for the entire base, and radio towers maintained communication with the outside world. Along the fence, surveillance cameras and motion sensors ensured constant monitoring of the territory. This place seemed impregnable and fully prepared for any surprises. When we approached the gates, we were met by a tall soldier in a strict uniform with a stern look. His rifle hung on his shoulder, ready for immediate use. We presented our passes, which we had ordered in advance. He carefully examined them, comparing them with our documents. We had the minimum allowed number of team members, 3 people, which was optimal. The soldier looked at us once more, then nodded and let us through. The 3 of us walked along the deserted path, and the surrounding forest seemed strangely quiet. Tall trees with dense foliage seemed to loom over us, creating the impression that we were the only people in this vast, ancient forest. Occasionally, a patrol unit passed by, their footsteps echoing dully in the silence, followed by oppressive quiet. Birds did not sing, and even the wind seemed to have stopped, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching our movements. As we approached the barrier, the golden shimmer became more distinct. The tall grass and shrubs along the path gradually gave way to sparse but oddly twisted trees, whose branches reached skyward like grasping hands. The sky was covered with gray clouds, giving the whole landscape a gloomy and ominous appearance. The ground was littered with small stones and tree roots, making us tread carefully to avoid tripping. When we reached the barrier, it stood before us in all its mysterious splendor. The transparent wall, shimmering with golden light, looked unreal, like a mirage. It glimmered and sparkled as if composed of millions of tiny fireflies frozen in the air. The barrier appeared majestic and frightening at the same time, beckoning us with its mysterious glow. We stopped in front of it, feeling a slight vibration in the air. Our hearts were pounding, our breathing became erratic. This place inspired awe and fear. It was unclear what awaited us on the other side, but there was no turning back. I looked at Uncle Bill and Uncle Fred. Determination and fear shone in their eyes. "Ready?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from trembling. They nodded. We exchanged one last glance, realizing this might be our last encounter with the reality we knew. At that moment, I felt the full weight of our decision, but there was no going back. We stepped forward. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. A light tingling sensation ran through my body, like an electric shock. The golden shimmer became unbearably bright, and I closed my eyes for a second. When I opened my eyes, the world around us had changed. We stood in a different place. The trees here were taller and denser, their trunks covered in moss, and their branches intertwined, creating a thick canopy that almost completely blocked out daylight. The air was filled with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something undefined that caused anxiety. It felt like the forest was breathing, watching us like a living entity. Every step we took was accompanied by the crunch of twigs underfoot and the rustling of leaves. But these sounds were barely audible over the strange noises coming from all sides. We heard distant howling, muffled growls, as if invisible creatures were communicating, warning of our presence. Occasionally, there was a sound like metal scraping against stone or the sudden flapping of wings, as if something huge was taking off among the trees. Our hearts were pounding in our chests, adrenaline coursing through our veins, making every cell of our bodies alert. We moved cautiously, trying not to make unnecessary noise, feeling the invisible eyes on us. I kept my sword ready, its hilt surprisingly warm in my hand. Uncle Bill gripped his axe, and Uncle Fred held his silenced pistol, periodically glancing around. We cautiously scanned our surroundings, trying to catch the slightest movement in the surrounding darkness. Soon we came to a fork where several paths diverged in different directions, disappearing into the dense forest. Each path seemed equally mysterious and dangerous. We couldn't predict which one would lead us to our goal and which to our demise. Trusting our intuition, we chose a path leading north. The path led us through dense underbrush, where trees intertwined their branches, creating an almost impenetrable canopy overhead. We walked slowly and carefully, trying not to lose our vigilance. I closely examined the surrounding vegetation, hoping to find familiar mushrooms and plants from my father's diary. We had a month's worth of food, but we knew we needed to start looking for food sources early in these conditions. Along the way, I noticed several familiar mushrooms mentioned in my father's diary. Their caps were bright purple with small white spots. My father wrote that they were edible and highly nutritious. I carefully cut a few mushrooms and put them in my bag. Nearby grew other, less familiar plants that also caught my attention. I also noticed some bushes with small berries that my father described as safe to eat. Their dark red fruits were sweet and juicy, perfect for a quick snack while trekking. Fortunately, the first 2 days of our journey went smoothly. We didn't encounter any creatures, and only the rustling of the forest accompanied us. However, on the second day, as the sun began to set, we heard soft footsteps coming from the depths of the forest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end with fear and anticipation. Could it be them? I thought, signaling everyone to hide in the nearest bushes. We froze, holding our breath, watching the path through the foliage. Soon, goblins appeared on the trail, the very ones the first hunter had described. They were small, with green skin and long ears. Their movements were quick and silent, and their eyes gleamed with malice. We saw that there were only 5 of them, and they were carrying a creature in a cage. I didn't know what this creature was. It wasn't even in my father's diary. It looked like a cat, but had 3 tails that swayed gracefully. The tips of its ears had fluffy tufts of fur, resembling the tufts on a lynx. Its entire body was covered in snow-white fur that seemed incredibly soft and fluffy. The only thing that stood out against this snowy white backdrop was its eyes. Bright gold, shining like precious gems. The creature looked frightened and exhausted, its ears pressed flat against its head, and its eyes nervously scanned the surroundings. It was entirely unique and mysterious, something out of the deepest realms of fantasy. Even in this strange and dangerous forest, it seemed extraordinarily special. We didn't move, trying not to make a sound to avoid revealing our presence. Our hearts were pounding, and I felt sweat running down my back. But then one of the goblins stopped, turned its head in our direction, and sniffed the air. I cursed silently. These creatures had an incredible sense of smell. The goblin screamed, pointing in our direction, and there was alarm in its cry. "They've spotted us," I whispered, drawing my bow. My uncles also prepared for battle, their faces becoming focused and tense. Uncle Fred was the first to open fire. His silenced pistol made a quiet puff, and the first goblin fell to the ground with a hole in its head. 2 other goblins scattered, trying to take cover behind trees. I released an arrow that pierced one of them in the shoulder, causing it to drop the cage with the mysterious creature. Uncle Bill charged forward with his axe, swinging it in a deadly arc. Uncle Fred didn't miss. A few more quiet shots, and 2 more goblins fell dead. But the remaining goblin managed to draw a knife and charged at me. I dropped my bow and drew my sword, engaging in close combat. The goblin was fast and aggressive, its strikes precise and powerful. But my armor, made from composite materials, deflected several blows, giving me a chance to counterattack. I struck, aiming for the goblin's side, and my sword's blade cut through its flesh, making it shriek in pain. It tried to strike me again, but Uncle Bill arrived just in time, decapitating the goblin with his axe. When the last one fell, we stood among the bodies, breathing heavily. Fred still held his pistol ready, scanning the surroundings. Uncle Bill slowly lowered his axe, and I released the hilt of my sword, realizing the fight was over. "We did it," I exhaled, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Good job, guys," Uncle Bill said, patting my shoulder. We inspected the bodies and then turned our attention to the cage with the mysterious creature still inside. It looked at us with its bright golden eyes, as if evaluating our intentions. We decided to free the mysterious creature, being careful not to touch it, as it could be dangerous. After opening the cage, I stepped back, waiting to see what it would do. Suddenly, the creature quickly jumped out of the cage and ran toward me. It leaped onto my shoulder and settled there, like an ordinary house cat. I froze, unsure of how to react. "What the?" I muttered, carefully trying to pick up the creature and put it on the ground. But it jumped back onto my shoulder, as if deciding this was its new place. "Looks like it likes you," Uncle Fred said with a grin. We exchanged glances and decided to keep the creature with us. We needed to leave the area quickly, as we could encounter more goblins or even more dangerous creatures. We quickly gathered our things and continued on our way, moving further north. Another couple of days passed. Along the way, we encountered many strange fantasy creatures, but tried to pass by quietly to avoid incidents. We saw firefly dragons, tiny dragons whose wings glowed with a soft blue light like fireflies. They fluttered between the trees, leaving glowing trails. In one of the swamps, we noticed bog fairies, creatures with transparent wings and seaweed instead of hair, their eyes glowing in the twilight, and their voices singing melodies that sounded like calls from the depths. We also met a flock of shadow ravens, large black birds with eyes glowing with green fire and long claws on their feet. They perched on the branches of tall trees, watching us closely without making any move to attack. On the 5th day, luck finally smiled on us. The cat, whom I had named Ed, began to fidget on my shoulder, as if something was bothering him. Then he stubbornly tried to lead us to the left of the path. I decided this was not a coincidence, and told my uncles to follow me. We carefully made our way through the bushes, and after about 100 feet, we stumbled upon a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood a huge ancient tree, its branches forming graceful arches overhead. But the most remarkable thing was that next to the tree on the ground grew a purple flower, the very one we were looking for. My heart beat faster, and I wanted to rush forward. But Uncle Bill grabbed my shoulder. "Don't rush," he warned. I came to my senses and realized I could have endangered all of us. We crouched and carefully moved across the clearing. Almost reaching the flower, we suddenly heard a deep voice ordering us to stop. I froze in fear and began to look around, but saw no one. Glancing at my uncle's faces, I saw they were filled with horror. Following their gaze, I saw the tree, and it had a huge face. This face looked as if it were carved from the tree's very bark, but it appeared alive. The eyes, deep and wise, seemed to look through us. The large nose, with a rough surface, and lips, sculpted by nature, moved slowly as the tree spoke. The roots at the base of the tree writhed like snakes, and the leaves on the branches rustled softly, as if it were breathing. The tree looked at us with its ancient eyes and said, "I know you want to take the flower, but to do so you must solve my riddle. If you fail, you will face death." We stood, pondering its words, trying to find the right answer. The riddle was, "I cannot be seen, but I can be felt. I have no form, but I can fill any space. What am I?" We thought hard, and Uncle Fred decided to answer. "It's a shadow," he exclaimed. But the tree just shook its head, its eyes glowing. "Incorrect," it boomed, and the flower immediately retracted into the ground as if it had never existed. I cursed and rushed to the spot where it had just been, but it was useless. At that moment, the tree opened its mouth and screamed. The scream was deafening, piercing to the bone. The forest answered with thousands of voices, and we realized that all the monsters in the area were coming our way. "Run!" Uncle Bill shouted, and we bolted from the clearing. We raced through the dense forest, leaping over roots and bushes, trying not to look back. Around us we heard the approaching footsteps and roars of monsters summoned by the tree's cry. We ran, not knowing the way, and soon found ourselves in a silvery, transparent cloud. "What is this?" Uncle Fred shouted, but it was too late. I realized we had entered an anomaly but couldn't do anything. Everything around us swirled, and the world began to blur before my eyes. The last thing I heard was a deafening roar before I lost consciousness. I woke up realizing I was being dragged somewhere. Opening my eyes, I saw the treetops above me. Struggling to lift my head, I saw that I was tied up and being dragged. Next to me lay Uncle Fred, still unconscious. We were being dragged across the ground, and every bump of stones and roots against our bodies made me wince in pain. I squinted and looked at who was dragging us. My heart sank when I realized we were doomed. This creature was one of the most dangerous in the forest. In his journal, my father called it the Butcher. It was a massive man, his face hidden under a gas mask. Whether he was human or a monster remained a mystery. Most likely the latter, as two enormous antlers grew from his head. He wore no clothing on his upper body, just pants and massive boots. His belt was adorned with skulls, and in one hand he held a huge axe. With the other, he dragged us by a rope, pulling us along the ground. My clothes were already filled with grass and dirt. Fear and horror gripped me. We were in the hands of the most dangerous creature in the forest, and our chances of rescue seemed slim. The forest around us was dense and dark, the rustling and sounds growing louder with each step of the Butcher. Soon, Uncle Fred began to wake up. He opened his eyes slightly and whispered, "Where are we? What's happening?" "Quiet!" I hissed at him, fearing to attract our captor's attention. The butcher continued to drag us through the forest, his steps heavy and confident. Every movement of his massive body seemed like a threat. Soon we approached a small cabin next to which stood an old, dilapidated shed. The cabin was made of old logs covered in moss and dirt. It looked abandoned, but no less frightening. The windows were boarded up, the door crooked and creaking ominously with every movement. Next to it stood the shed, even more decrepit. The wooden walls of the shed were half collapsed, and the roof was caving in. Scattered around were numerous bones and skulls, intensifying the sense of dread. The butcher dragged us further, heading toward the old shed. Each of his movements was smooth and confident, like a predator sure of its prey. We tried to resist, but the ropes were too tight, and his strength overwhelmed any attempt to break free. When we were dragged into the shed, our terror only grew. Inside, it was dark and damp. Hanging from the ceiling were 2 ropes, to which corpses were tied, swaying back and forth, emitting a faint creaking sound. The corpses were in a state of decomposition, their faces and bodies mutilated. The smell of death and decay filled the air, making it hard to breathe. The butcher easily lifted me and tied me to one of the beams. The rope wound around my body, making movement impossible. His hands were rough and strong like steel clamps. I felt my head spin from fear and pain as he tightened the knots. "Please don't," I whispered, but my voice was lost in the silence of the shed. He then tied Uncle Fred to the neighboring beam in the same manner. Fred tried to resist, but all his efforts were in vain. We both ended up tied and helpless, hanging like puppets in this horrific place. The shed was dimly lit only by the weak light seeping through the cracks in the walls. The floor was covered in dirt, bloody stains, and remains. In the corner stood an old, rusty saw, and nearby lay several severed limbs. In another corner, various torture tools were visible. Hooks, knives, hammers, all looking terrifying and sinister. The butcher stood before us, his gas mask hiding his face, but I could feel his cold, soulless eyes watching us. We hung helplessly, our hearts pounding with fear, and our minds refusing to accept what was happening. At that moment, we realized the hopelessness of our situation and the horror awaiting us. Blood rushed to my head, making me feel worse. Soon, the butcher left, leaving us hanging in this nightmarish shed. I began to think about Uncle Bill. I hoped he was all right, the thought crossing my mind before my consciousness blurred with pain and fear. We hung there for some time when I suddenly heard a rustling. Soon, a white creature appeared before me. It was Ed. I felt a bit of relief, although I understood that he was unlikely to help us. He approached and came closer to me, and with the last of my strength I whispered, "Help us." Ed looked at me intently with his golden eyes, and it seemed he understood my words. Turning around, he bounded outside. We continued hanging, and I didn't know how much time had passed, but it seemed like my end was near. I looked at Uncle Fred. He was red as a beet, blood rushing to his head, and he looked on the verge of losing consciousness. Soon I heard a noise outside. The butcher had returned. He untied our ropes and dragged us outside. In front of the house, we saw a huge bonfire with a massive cauldron hanging over it. Something inside was bubbling and boiling. A thought flashed through my mind that this was the end when the butcher dragged us closer to the fire and threw us to the ground. We lay on the cold ground, feeling the heat from the fire, and watched as the butcher went into the house. Fear and terror gripped me, but a flicker of hope still lingered somewhere in my mind. After the butcher went into the house, small creatures began emerging from the door. They were vile and disgusting, their appearance instilling disgust and fear. These creatures were no more than 3 feet tall, with thin, skeletal bodies covered in gray-green, scaly skin. Their heads were disproportionately large, with huge eyes glowing with a dim, yellowish light. Their mouths, full of small, sharp teeth, were twisted in a grim smirk, and long claws on their hands and feet added to their sinister appearance. Their ears were long and pointed like those of bats, and their noses were thin and hooked. Each creature wore a dirty, tattered rag that seemed to have once been clothing, but now only emphasized their ugliness. Green, viscous saliva dripped from their mouths, leaving sticky trails on the ground. They surrounded us, pulling at our hair, ears, and noses, examining us with their disgusting hands. Their touch was cold and rough, and each contact sent waves of revulsion and pain through us. They chattered among themselves in an incomprehensible language, their voices high-pitched and piercing like the screeching of enraged rats. "Get away!" I shouted, trying to fend them off, but they only laughed with their raspy laughter and continued their disgusting games. Soon they began to dance around the fire in a chaotic and unnatural manner, like puppets on strings. Their glowing eyes flickered in the firelight, creating the illusion of sinister flames dancing in the night. They danced, mocking and shrieking, their voices merging into one horrifying cacophony. The fire burned brightly, the flames greedily consuming the wood, and the small creatures continued their eerie ritual. They jumped, twisted, and occasionally threw small objects into the fire that they pulled from their rags. Bones, tufts of fur, small skulls. The flames flared up even more, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air. I felt fear gripping me tighter and tighter. Uncle Fred was in the same state, his face white and his eyes full of terror. We were helpless, tied up and surrounded by these vile creatures, and every moment felt like an eternity. Suddenly, I heard a loud roar somewhere nearby, then the sound of footsteps and breaking trees approaching from the forest. The series of nightmares seemed never-ending. I no longer wanted to think about anything when suddenly I heard the sound of a horn, echoing from all directions. The small monsters began to panic, their movements becoming chaotic and erratic. The butcher emerged from the house, his head concealed under a gas mask, quickly scanning the area for unwanted guests. Suddenly something fell nearby, and I realized it was a smoke grenade. Its thick, acrid smoke quickly filled the area, obscuring the view. I felt someone grab me and start pulling. Unable to resist, I let this unknown person drag me out of the smoke. Soon we were in the forest, and I realized I was being pulled by a group of people in ordinary hunting clothes. They dragged me to a safe distance, then began cutting the rope, freeing me. Nearby, I saw Uncle Fred, who had also been rescued. All the faces were unfamiliar to me, but I was glad we had been freed. One by one, they helped us to our feet and told us to follow them. Everything happened in a hurry, as the monsters were chasing us. We ran through the forest, hearts pounding with adrenaline and fear. Trees blurred past us, their branches whipping our faces and bodies, but we didn't stop. In the distance, a terrifying roar could be heard, urging us onward. The hunters who saved us moved confidently and quickly, knowing exactly where to go. We crossed streams, climbed over fallen trees, and pushed through dense thickets. The forest seemed endless, and every step was a struggle. The hunters covered us, occasionally glancing back to check if the monsters were getting closer. The noise of the chase didn't abate, but we kept running, not letting fear overtake us. Eventually, we burst into a small clearing surrounded by thick bushes. The hunters quickly organized a defense, positioning themselves around us and preparing for a possible attack. Uncle Fred and I were breathing heavily, but we understood that we were finally in relative safety. "Are you okay?" asked one of the hunters, a tall man with sharp features and piercing eyes. "Yes, thank you," I replied, still recovering from the horror we'd just experienced. "We need to leave here," said another hunter. "Those monsters won't stop." We nodded and, gathering the last of our strength, continued through the forest. The sounds of the chase gradually faded, and we managed with difficulty to lose the monsters. Soon we emerged at a small village consisting of a dozen houses. The houses were simple, wooden with thatched roofs, but they looked sturdy and reliable. Along the narrow, trodden paths stood people, busy with their tasks. Some were mending nets, others were handling supplies, and some were cleaning weapons. Seeing us, they turned in surprise, whispering among themselves, discussing our group. Leading our group was a woman. She was tall and slender, with sharp facial features and expressive green eyes. Her long, dark hair was braided into a tight plait that hung down to her waist. She wore practical hunting clothes, a leather jacket with numerous pockets filled with various tools and supplies. She moved with confidence and grace, as if she knew every path in this forest. "What is this place?" I asked her as we walked through the village. "Where are we going?" "This is a camp of surviving hunters," she replied without slowing her pace. "We're going to see our leader. He will want to talk to you." We reached a house in the center of the village. This house was slightly larger than the others and looked better maintained. In front of the house was a small garden with flowers and herbs, and above the entrance hung an amulet made of bones and feathers. As we approached, a man came out of the house. He was fit and confident looking. His face seemed familiar to me. I stared at him, and suddenly it hit me. It was Joe, the very guy who had discovered the meteorite. But what was he doing here? "Joe!" I blurted out. He looked at me, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Yes, it's me," he replied, coming closer. "Welcome to our camp. I'm glad you're alive." "But what are you doing here?" I asked, still not believing my eyes. "It's a long story," he smiled. "Let's go inside and I'll explain everything." We entered the house, where the interior was cozy. There were wooden tables and chairs, and maps and hunting trophies adorned the walls. Joe gestured for us to sit. I asked him what this camp was, and he looked at us in surprise. "Didn't they tell you? You've ended up in the second zone." "What?" I asked, confused. "What's the second zone?" He looked at us even more surprised and asked, "Didn't you pass through the red barrier?" We exchanged glances and told him our story about how we ended up in this part of the forest. Joe listened attentively, his expression growing more serious. "I'm sorry to tell you this," he finally said, "but you've entered a new level of the forest. There's no way out from here." Hearing his words, I felt a cold fear grip my heart. Remembering my mother, I felt deep anxiety and pain. What would happen to her if we never managed to return? "How come?" Uncle Fred asked desperately. "There must be some way out." Joe shook his head. "We've studied this forest for a long time and know that the second zone is a trap. It's designed so that people who end up here can't go back. We ourselves got here several years ago and have been trying to find a way out ever since. But so far, without success." I hung my head, feeling growing hopelessness. Questions and fears swirled in my mind, but one thing was clear. We were stuck in this sinister forest, and our hope for salvation was becoming increasingly elusive. I tried to gather my thoughts, but panic was overwhelming me. It seemed like there was no way out of this place. What should we do now? I turned to Joe, hoping he would tell me more about how he ended up here. He silently pulled a metal flask from his coat, took a long swig, and then exhaled heavily. "Sorry," he said, wiping an invisible drop of sweat from his forehead. "Sometimes you need a little help. This is whiskey. I make it myself from local plants. Life here isn't easy. Every day is a struggle for survival. How did I get here? Well, that's a long story." He lowered his gaze to the ground, as if memories of the past were a heavy burden. "It was about 8 years ago," Joe continued. "After that brief fame and money that fell into my lap, I decided to venture into this forest. I wanted to uncover its secrets. I knew the zone appeared after a meteorite fell, though there was no direct evidence. Questions plagued me. What is this place? What creatures inhabit it?" Joe paused, as if debating whether to continue. Then, as if making up his mind, he spoke again. "At first, I studied the outer zone, delving deeper every day. I gradually adapted, learned to find food, defend against monsters. I figured out which creatures to run from and which could be ignored. I was with a man, a brilliant mind who helped us survive. His name was Harry Black." At that name, both my uncle and I jumped up. "You knew my father?" I blurted out before I could fully process his words. Joe raised his eyebrows in surprise. "So you're his son? Harry talked about you often. Well, I'll be damned." "Where is he now?" I asked, already feeling I wouldn't like the answer. Joe shook his head. "I haven't seen him in a couple of years." The world around me seemed to darken. I sat down, crushed by the realization that I wouldn't see him. Noticing my distress, Joe continued, "Your father and I traveled together for a long time, venturing deeper until we stumbled upon the red zone. It was a barrier similar to the one before, but everything inside was much more dangerous. The monster that nearly killed you is one of the most terrifying here. You're lucky you didn't encounter its pet." I involuntarily shuddered, remembering the huge shadow that approached us in that moment. But Joe kept talking, and his words led me from fear to something even more unsettling. Soon we realized the barrier wouldn't let us back out. That threw me into despair. But not your father. He just shrugged and continued to explore the new zone. I stayed here, to be honest. I didn't have the guts to go with him. The day we parted, something unexpected happened. We stumbled upon something enormous like a snake and tried to escape. It seemed like it was all over. But suddenly, unknown beings appeared. Joe stopped to take another sip of whiskey before continuing. These beings looked almost human, but with elongated heads and strange faces. I'd call them aliens from some game. They flew in on devices that resembled flying motorcycles and destroyed the creature chasing us. When the chaos settled, they tried to communicate with us, but we didn't understand their language. Then they gestured for us to follow them. Harry agreed, but I stayed. I haven't seen him since. Joe fell silent, looking around as if reliving it all again. I built a home here and gradually found others who ended up in this zone. That's how our camp formed. We lived together and tried to survive. I pulled out my father's journal and flipped through the pages again, hoping to find some mention of these strange beings, but found nothing of the sort. When Joe saw the journal, his face immediately changed. He jumped up in surprise. Rushing over, he snatched it from my hands and began feverishly examining it. "This is your father's journal. How did you get it? Did he find a way out?" Joe's eyes burned with worry and hope. I told him how I got the journal and asked if my father could have given it to me when he was still in the outer zone. Joe shook his head. "There's a lot of information here about monsters that only live in the red zone. So either he managed to pass the journal somehow, or he got out himself," Joe said, lost in thought. We examined the journal together, but found no clues or answers. Questions still plagued me. Why did my father give me this journal? What was he trying to tell me? Our thoughts were interrupted by a local who entered the room carrying some items. He explained that he had followed our tracks and found our weapons and supplies. When I received my sword, I felt a sense of relief. I had felt vulnerable without it. The man also handed me a bow and arrows, and my uncle his pistol. I asked if he had seen any signs of a third person, but he shook his head, saying the tracks only indicated 2 people. Joe wanted to say something but was interrupted again. A tall girl entered the room and announced that the ceremony was ready to begin. I was puzzled. What ceremony? But Joe just nodded and ordered us to follow him. We went outside and headed to the edge of the village. There, on a small clearing with graves, people had gathered. In the center was a fresh grave. Joe stepped forward, clasped his hands in prayer, and began to speak. "We are gathered here to say goodbye to Andrew Hayes, a man whose courage and selflessness saved us many times. Andrew was someone you could always rely on in the toughest times. He wasn't afraid to face danger, didn't give up when everyone else lost hope. Today we bid farewell to him, but his spirit will remain with us. May his path be bright, and his soul find peace in places where there is no pain or fear. We will remember him for the rest of our days." After the ceremony, Joe called us over, his face tense, as if he was about to share something he'd rather keep hidden. "I didn't tell you about one of the main dangers of this place," he began, quietly, almost in a whisper. "Andrew fell victim to the latest anomaly that happened just yesterday. Every month something terrible happens here. Spores rise from the ground, killing everything alive. These spores look like flying fluff, blown by the wind. They destroy everything they touch, devouring the victim entirely. When a ball of fluff the size of a football engulfs its target, it disappears, and no one knows where these things come from. But it's not just people who suffer. The entire red zone descends into chaos. From giant monsters to the smallest creatures, everything seeks shelter. We want to get out of here because there will never be peace in this place." We listened to him in shock, realizing just how dangerous our situation had become. The new information only deepened our sense of hopelessness. Afterward, Joe showed us to the house, assigned us rooms, and gradually, we began to meet the other villagers. Life in this place was hard, but the locals had learned to survive in conditions that would break most people. Every day was filled with tasks from hunting to scouting. The food was simple. We ate whatever we could find. One day, the guys brought in a huge crocodile and we started roasting it on a spit. But even this simple task wasn't without its oddities. To avoid attracting monsters with smoke and smell, they used a peculiar flower with dark purple petals. This flower could absorb smoke like a sponge and process it, leaving only a faint herbal scent. The camp used other strange tools, evidence of how deeply the villagers had adapted to this place. For example, they had long, thin stalks they called food roots. When these roots were inserted into the ground, they sucked nutrients directly from the soil, turning them into a porridge-like substance that could be eaten. The taste was awful, but this food helped during lean times. The villagers also used strange fireflies that not only glowed but also repelled some small predators. These creatures were gathered into small nets, resembling lanterns which hung around the houses, providing some measure of safety at night. A month passed, and each day brought new challenges. We continued our search, trying to find traces of Uncle Bill. However, we found no sign of him, and with each passing day, Uncle Fred grew more despondent, though he kept his emotions to himself. But there was nothing we could do except keep searching and hope for the best. During this time, I grew close to Joe. To my surprise, he revealed himself to be a strong and decisive leader. The guy who used to sit on the roof stargazing was now leading a group of people surviving in this dangerous place. Surrounded by threats and strange races, the people here had banded together, helping one another, creating a shared sense of safety in this chaotic world. On our scouting missions, I gradually learned about many creatures, from small animals to monsters that I could have only imagined in books. This place was an incredible blend of fantasy and reality, as if someone had plucked beings from various genres of fantasy, science fiction, and even the real world, and crammed them all into this cursed forest. The races Joe mentioned, including the high-tech race and goblins, made me wonder what else was hidden in the depths of this vast forest. While hunting, I preferred to use a bow and arrows, occasionally resorting to my sword if a creature got too close. Uncle Fred still relied on his pistol, but the ammunition was running out fast, so I began teaching him how to use a bow, which the local craftsman made right in the camp. Despite the villagers seeming to have adapted to the environment, accidents still happened. One of the worst incidents occurred recently. Something resembling a giant tick crawled into one of the houses at night. The creature silently latched onto one of the residents, swelling to the size of a ball as it drained all the blood from the poor man. The village was awakened by a girl's scream the next morning. We all rushed over and saw a horrifying sight. A dried-up mummy lay on the bed, and next to it, a blood-red sphere was slowly crawling into the forest. We held another burial ceremony, and I was once again reminded of how dangerous this place was. A month passed, and the day known locally as Harvest Day was approaching. The name alone was ominous and caused anxiety among everyone in the camp. People were preparing, gathering in groups, discussing plans. Fear and tension filled the air. Joe gathered us all before dawn and explained what to expect. He warned that there weren't many of those deadly spores, but if one chose a victim, escaping it would be nearly impossible. Weapons were useless against them, so on this day, everyone tried to find shelter. People scattered into the forest to reduce the chances of encountering these creatures since the spores tended to cluster where there were more people. When the day came, Uncle Fred and I decided to leave together. Early in the morning, we stood at the edge of the camp, saying goodbye to those we had befriended. Joe gave me a tight hug, as if it were our last meeting. It seemed this farewell tradition had arisen for a reason. No one knew if they would survive the day. With one last look at the houses and friends, we stepped into the woods. The forest greeted us with an oppressive silence that was thick with tension, as if the air itself was vibrating with invisible electricity. But soon, the silence was broken by strange sounds. Rustling, howling, and distant cries filled the forest. It seemed that not only us, but all the creatures of this place were bracing for the impending disaster. As we walked, a giant lizard raced past us, paying us no attention. It was clearly frightened, which only heightened our anxiety. Something terrible was coming, and every creature in this forest was trying to survive at all costs. We moved quickly and carefully until we stumbled upon a cave. Fortunately, it was empty, and we decided to make this our shelter. I looked at my uncle and noticed how much he had changed. Thinner, with sharp features, he no longer resembled the jolly, chubby man I once knew. Now, sitting beside me was a tough, battle-hardened man. Sitting on a rock, Uncle Fred took out his bow and began stringing it, but it was clear he was still struggling to get used to the weapon. He grumbled as usual. "Michael, look, if I pull the string like this, the arrow goes farther, but the accuracy drops. And if I press it to my ear, I shoot more accurately, but the range decreases. What do you think is better?" he asked, trying to find the perfect balance. I was about to answer when I suddenly heard a strange sound. It was a crackling coming from beneath the ground, followed by a howling noise, like a church choir. The sound was muffled, but when I pressed my ear to the ground, it became clearer. These were signs of the approaching anomaly, and cold fear gripped me. We silently prayed that these creatures wouldn't appear near us, but apparently our prayers went unanswered. Suddenly, a loud crack rang out, and the ground 10 feet away from us began to split open. From the fissure emerged a disgusting sprout, resembling a tangle of slimy tendrils. The tendrils stretched out, growing longer, until a bud at their end opened like a giant worm. Inside, the bud was a spore. It was a strange combination of a dandelion and fluff. In the center was a core, from which thin hairs radiated, forming a sphere. At the ends of these hairs were tiny clusters that resembled hands, twitching restlessly, trying to grasp something. The spore floated slowly in the air as if searching for its prey. We sat still, holding our breath, hoping to remain unnoticed. But the spore spotted me. It began to drift toward me, reaching out with its sinister tendrils. At that moment, my uncle shouted, "Run, Michael, run!" I didn't hesitate. Leaping to my feet, I bolted into the forest, feeling the deadly creature closing in behind me. My heart pounded in my throat and my feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted through the trees. Around me, terrifying cries echoed. Creatures roared, crashing through bushes and branches, fleeing in all directions in panic. The forest was full of chaos, and I was part of it. The spore didn't relent. It pursued me, as if it was determined to fulfill its deadly mission. I was growing tired, my breath became ragged, and my legs felt heavy. But I knew that if I stopped or stumbled, it would be the end of me. I kept my eyes on the ground, avoiding roots and rocks. Suddenly, I saw the outlines of a village ahead. It was an ancient village, resembling a primitive settlement of Native Americans. Skulls hung on the fences, and I instantly knew this was a place where hostile creatures lived. But I had no choice. I dashed inside and quickly realized the village was deserted. Without stopping, I kept running, knowing the spore was still on my tail. Ahead, I spotted a large structure, and though I knew I was trapping myself, I decided to take shelter there. I was already out of breath, and this building was my only hope. As I approached the door, I glanced back and saw that the spore was almost upon me. I flung the door open and rushed inside. In the center of the room stood a huge goblin. He was slightly shorter than me, but for a goblin he was a giant. Seeing me, the goblin panicked and aimed his weapon at me. But with lightning speed, I drew my sword, deflected his spear, and rolled past him. At that moment, the spore, unable to react in time, collided directly with the goblin. The goblin screamed. The spore began to envelop him, covering his body with its hair-like tendrils and those tiny hands that started burrowing into his flesh. Within moments, his body began to disintegrate, and a green energy cloud formed in his place. I stood in shock, watching this spectacle, and suddenly noticed the outline of the goblin within the cloud. Slowly, I realized this might be the creature's soul. The spore started to consume his soul, and the creature emitted terrible sounds, as if experiencing the most excruciating pain of its life. When it finally devoured the goblin, the spore curled up, and a crack appeared in the ground, into which it slipped, as if having completed its mission. I stood there, stunned by what I had just witnessed, trying to comprehend what had happened. What was this creature, and why was it hunting us? Carefully avoiding the crack, I headed for the exit. Outside, my uncle was standing, breathing heavily. It seemed he had been chasing after me. Seeing me, he immediately asked, "Are you all right?" I nodded and he walked over, patting me on the shoulder, trying to catch his breath. We were both shaken, realizing how close death had come to us today. Suddenly, a head peeked out of my uncle's backpack. It was Ed, our faithful little companion. He sniffed the air as if checking for danger, then crawled out fully and leaped onto my shoulder. I stroked his head, relieved that he was okay. But the relief was short-lived. Angry shouts echoed in the distance, reminding me that we were still deep in enemy territory. Without wasting a second, I grabbed my uncle's hand and tried to run, but our path was quickly blocked by goblins. There were too many of them. They surrounded us in a tight circle, snarling and pointing their spears at us. My uncle cursed, realizing that our escape had failed. He muttered quietly that this seemed to be the end. There was no way we would get out of this alive. An old goblin emerged from one of the huts, apparently their shaman. His figure was hunched, his skin deeply wrinkled, and his eyes gleamed with malice and ancient wisdom. He was adorned with bone and feather amulets, and a horned helmet decorated with small skulls sat atop his head. The shaman headed toward the main building we had just escaped from. Upon seeing the aftermath of what had happened inside, he howled in fury and shouted something in his rasping language. The goblin crowd instantly became agitated. They began jumping, waving their weapons, and shouting menacingly. I realized that now we were truly doomed. But suddenly, the shaman shouted something else, and the goblins, obeying his command, started pushing us toward the edge of the village. There stood a few small, shabby huts that looked like prisons. One of the goblins flung open the door to one of them and, throwing a spear in our direction, gestured for us to enter. We had no choice but to comply. When we entered, it was dark and stuffy inside. In the corner, lying on filthy straw, was a man. He was unconscious, but as we approached, we recognized him with a mix of horror and joy. It was Uncle Bill. My heart skipped a beat as I knelt beside him to check for a pulse. It was weak, but there, he was alive. We rushed to him, overwhelmed by both relief and fear. I gently shook him, trying to wake him. When he opened his eyes, they were filled with pain and exhaustion. We quickly pulled supplies from our bag and began to give him water and food. At first, Uncle Bill grabbed the flask as if he hadn't drunk in ages. Water trickled down his neck, dripping onto the dirty floor. Then he coughed and ravenously attacked the food. He ate as if he couldn't believe it was real, tears streaming down his cheeks. It was hard to watch him, seeing how emaciated he was. When he finally had his fill, his strength gave out, and he lost consciousness again. We carefully laid him on the straw, covering him with a jacket, and waited, not knowing what would happen next. Outside, we could hear movements, muffled sounds, as if the whole village was coming alive. We didn't know what awaited us, but the sense of impending doom wouldn't leave us. Hours passed before Uncle Bill regained consciousness. He slowly opened his eyes and struggled to focus on us, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His voice trembled as he asked how we had found him. I began telling him everything that had happened to us, and he listened silently, barely able to believe his ears. When I finished, Uncle Bill spoke quietly. He told us how he had gotten caught in the anomaly and woke up here, where he was immediately captured. They starved him, and he survived by sheer luck. Looking at us, he shook his head sadly and said we should never have come here because these creatures wouldn't let us leave alive. I placed a hand on his shoulder and assured him that everything would be all right, though I didn't believe it myself. Night fell, and the noise in the village grew louder and more unsettling. It seemed that something terrible was about to happen, but we didn't know what it would be and couldn't do anything but wait. In the darkness, the village felt like a boiling cauldron, simmering with grim, inevitable fate. Suddenly, the dungeon door creaked open, and an ugly goblin face appeared in the doorway. His yellow eyes gleamed malevolently in the dim light, and he gestured for us to come out. We had no choice but to obey. One by one, we crawled out of the prison, feeling the cold grip of fear tighten around our hearts. Outside, we were met by a massive crowd of goblins. They had gathered in the village center, dancing and cheering as if celebrating something horrific. The sky was already shrouded in night, but in the middle of the village blazed a giant bonfire, above which hung an enormous cauldron on 2 poles. Next to it stood a ladder leading straight to the bubbling brew. The goblins surrounding it had a hungry gleam in their eyes, as if anticipating a feast. And then it hit me. They were planning to boil us alive. Uncle Fred, walking beside me, quietly cursed, muttering that human flesh must be a delicacy for these creatures. He gave a bitter smile, adding that this was the second attempt to boil us alive. We walked under the sharp gazes of the goblins toward the cauldron, ascending the creaky ladder. I feverishly looked around, searching for any escape, but there was no hope. Around us, there were angry shouts, eerie hoots. The bastards were clearly anticipating a bloody spectacle. At the top of the ladder, we were confronted by the shaman. He raised his staff and began to speak, and the crowd instantly fell silent. His voice sounded like metal scraping on glass, and each word sent a chill through my bones. When he finished, the shaman shook his staff, and the goblins once again erupted in frenzied excitement. They began to dance wildly, jerking their heads and shouting the same thing over and over. "Ucha! Ucha! Ucha!" Their cries merged into a terrifying chant, the meaning of which was unknown to us. Uncle Fred quietly drew his pistol, ready for a final battle. I tightened my grip on my sword, also prepared to fight to the end. Uncle Bill sat beside us, completely exhausted, too weak to fight. Ed, our little companion, fidgeted anxiously on my shoulder, sensing the approaching danger. Suddenly he lifted his head and began to howl, a strange, melodic howl that reminded me of a siren. The sound was unnatural, mesmerizing, and at the same time terrifying. When the goblins heard it, they froze, their crazed eyes darting around in fear. Ed continued to howl, and there was a sense of some ancient power in his voice. The shaman screamed, shouting orders, and the goblins rushed at us. At that moment, a gunshot rang out and the shaman's head exploded in a red fountain. It was Uncle Fred, making what he thought would be his first and last shot. The goblins charged at us with wild cries, and we desperately fought back. I swung my sword as best I could, fending off the attackers, while Uncle Fred fired his pistol, one magazine after another. But there were too many goblins. They swarmed us in waves, and it seemed that our end was inevitable. But suddenly, from beyond the village's borders, another howl rang out, loud, menacing, echoing through the forest. Massive creatures, much taller than a man, emerged from the darkness. These were enormous white cats, but instead of 3 tails like Ed's, they had 5. They pounced on the goblins, tearing into their necks and ripping them apart. One of the beasts landed beside us, and I heard a clear telepathic voice in my head, commanding us to climb onto its back. I froze, unsure of what was happening, but the voice was insistent. Gathering my courage, I began helping Uncle Bill and Fred onto the creature's back. Ed scampered up my shoulder, and soon all 3 of us were mounted on the beast. Without wasting any time, the creature took off, carrying us away from the village, with the others following close behind. We raced through the forest, hearing the sounds of battle and the dying screams of goblins fading behind us, until we disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind flames and blood. We rode on the back of the creature through the dark forest, overwhelmed by our thoughts. My heart pounded like a drum, and blood roared in my ears. I tried to grasp how we had survived once again, becoming increasingly convinced that it was thanks to Ed. Our little companion was more than he appeared. These creatures, so massive, so ancient, communicated with us telepathically. Apparently, we had encountered yet another intelligent race living in this cursed forest. The forest flashed by around us like a nightmare in fast motion. Branches scratched the air. Distant cries echoed between the trees. I tried to ask the creature where it was taking us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I thought about it, and in response, I heard a short, clear answer in my mind. A safe place. We rode through the forest all night, feeling the heavy shadows closing in around us as the sky slowly began to lighten. By dawn, we emerged into a clearing, bathed in the first rays of the sun. The creature stopped smoothly, and we slowly slid off its back. My legs were numb, and I began to stretch them, feeling the tingling in my muscles. Uncle Fred, breathing heavily, collapsed to the ground, trying to regain his strength. I looked back at the creature, wondering what would happen next. When I asked what we should do, it replied telepathically, "We part ways here." I froze, surprised. Why had it brought us here? But the creature seemed no longer interested in me. Its gaze was fixed on Ed, who was perched on my shoulder. They seemed to be communicating, without words, without sounds, just a tense silence between them. After that, the creature turned and disappeared into the forest without looking back, leaving us alone. Ed seemed to have decided to stay with us. I carefully scratched him behind the neck and asked, "Can you speak? Why don't you want to talk to me?" But he remained silent, looking at me with his clear eyes, full of mysteries I wasn't meant to solve. We sat in the clearing, tired and confused, not knowing what to do next. Slowly, the dawn painted the sky, dispelling the remnants of night's darkness. Suddenly, at the edge of the clearing, I noticed movement. Silhouettes began to emerge from the trees, one, then another, then more. A large crowd of beings was coming out of the forest, holding sticks with a symbol resembling the letter Y. I had no idea what it meant, but anxiety tightened in my chest. I instinctively prepared for a fight. The creatures moved silently, but as the light grew, I could see them more clearly. They resembled humans, but with disturbing differences. Their clothing was reminiscent of medieval garb. Gray linen shirts and pants, simple yet sturdy. However, on closer inspection, I noticed they had 6 fingers on their hands and lacked eyebrows. Their eyes were narrow, like those of snakes, devoid of warmth. Instead of a nose, they had 2 slits, and their mouths, without lips, revealed sharp, predatory teeth. They were both like humans and something entirely inhuman, like distorted versions of reptiles with skin like humans, and a gaze that sent chills down my spine. I didn't know what to expect from these beings, but then an old man stepped forward. His skin was wrinkled, and his eyes glowed with the wisdom and weariness of many years. He looked older than the others, and was likely their leader. Slowly raising his hand, he made a gesture as if to show he came in peace. Then he pointed at us and beckoned for us to follow. I exchanged glances with Uncle Fred and Uncle Bill. The creature that had saved us hadn't brought us here by chance. We decided to take the risk and accept the invitation. We helped Uncle Bill to his feet, his strength still depleted, and slowly moved in the direction indicated. The beings surrounded us on all sides, as if guarding us, but their gazes weren't hostile, more curious. They spoke to each other in an unfamiliar language, their strange whispers sounding like the rustling of dry leaves. Occasionally they cast long looks at us, as if trying to understand what kind of creatures we were. We walked through the forest, which grew denser and darker. The path was uneven, and the trees seemed to be trying to entangle us in their shadows. After some time, the forest began to thin, and a mountainous area opened before us. We saw a village built among the rocks. The houses were made of stone, laid in a rough but sturdy manner. At first glance, they resembled our human structures, but upon closer inspection, the differences were apparent. The roofs of the houses were made of a strange material, resembling dense leather or scales that were difficult to identify. The windows were narrow and elongated, like slits, and covered with something like a translucent film that shimmered in the morning sunlight. The doors were low and rounded, with metal bands that looked like runic symbols. The streets were paved with stone. The village was enveloped in silence, only occasionally broken by the whisper of the wind, and it felt both ancient and alive. We were led into the heart of the village, and as we moved forward, the villagers emerged from their homes, observing us with interest and caution. Their gazes were sharp, like those of predators, but there was something human in them, a mix of curiosity and wariness. In the center of the village, they led us to one of the larger houses, distinguished from the others by its sturdiness and massive structure. The beings who escorted us pointed to it and once again gestured that we could settle inside. They did this without words, but their intentions were clear. This place was our temporary shelter. Inside, the house was spacious and surprisingly warm. The stone walls were adorned with patterns carved with remarkable precision. The floor was covered with thick carpets made from a material resembling fur, but with an unfamiliar sheen. There was no furniture as we knew it, only low tables and cushions arranged in a circle. In the corner, a fireplace burned, its light casting flickering shadows on the walls. We settled on the floor, tired and tense, realizing we were in an entirely new world. I looked again at Ed, sitting on my shoulder, and felt that he understood something that was still beyond my grasp. Questions swirled in my mind, but the answers remained hidden, like everything around us. Thus, we made our home in this strange village, living among creatures that seemed to come from another world. Each day, the elder, the same man who had led us here the first time, would visit us. He tried to communicate with us, but our conversations always devolved into gestures and attempts to understand one another. It was as if we were playing a silent game where no one knew the rules. The days dragged on, and we continued our fruitless attempts to find common ground, until one day, something remarkable happened. Ed, our little companion, suddenly climbed onto my shoulder and quietly spoke in a soft, telepathic voice. "I will help." The voice was weak, barely perceptible, like a whisper, but I heard it. Apparently Ed didn't yet have the strength to speak consistently this way, but it was something. I froze in surprise, then scratched him behind the ear and quietly said, "Good job." When the elder tried to speak to us again, I suddenly understood him. A quiet voice echoed in my head. "You must help us find the artifact." Still in shock from what was happening, I asked, "What artifact?" After a moment, I noticed the elder flinch as if it had just dawned on him that we could communicate. His eyes widened in surprise, and then a glimmer of hope appeared on his face. Now that we knew we could converse through Ed, communication became possible. The elder, who introduced himself as Mew, explained that his tribe was called the Lunae. They had lived here for many generations, but according to legend, their ancestors came from another land before the god cast down a great fire from the sky. After that, Their lands were engulfed by a golden dome, and they found themselves here in these cursed lands. With each passing year, their tribe dwindled due to the deadly spores that appeared in the zone. Once, their numbers were countless, but now only this small village remained. As I listened to him, a terrible realization began to form in my mind. Could it be that their world had been consumed by a zone like the one that had appeared on our planet? A zone that had swallowed an entire civilization? The thought sent shivers down my spine, and I felt a cold knot in my chest. If this were true, the zone could be far more dangerous than we had ever imagined. When I asked what kind of artifact they were searching for, Mew spoke of a legend passed down through generations. It was said that somewhere beneath the ground, a treasure was hidden that could save them from the calamities plaguing their tribe. He offered to take us with him to find this place, and we agreed. We set off, and Mew led us through the forest to the entrance of a cave. Inside, it was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of decaying earth and wet stone. We moved cautiously, stepping over slippery rocks and listening to every sound echoing off the cave walls. The light from our torches cast flickering shadows, and at times it felt as if something ancient and unseen was watching us. The cave seemed endless. We walked for what felt like an eternity, until we found ourselves in a vast stone chamber. In its center stood a massive stone with strange carvings etched into its surface. The engravings were deep and old, covered with the patina of time. The carvings depicted scenes of battle, strange creatures, and incomprehensible symbols that seemed both familiar and alien. One image stood out: a tree surrounded by warriors. They were of different races. Some appeared beast-like, others resembled humans. Leading them were beings holding a stone above their heads, glowing with a sinister light. It seemed as though they were fighting against the tree, as if it were something ancient and hostile. I didn't know what it meant, but when I noticed the letter Y carved into the stone, I suddenly understood where the Looney tribe had gotten their symbol. It was the symbol of the treasure, and I recalled similar drawings in my father's journal. I had once dismissed them as mere doodles in the margins, but now these drawings began to make sense. I pulled out the journal and flipped through it, stopping on the page with the drawings. And then it hit me. These sketches might have been a map. I showed them to Mew, and as he studied the pages thoughtfully, he said he recognized one of the locations depicted on the map. It was the symbol of a human skull, which, according to him, was located in a certain part of their lands. Excited, I realized that if we found this landmark, we could head north and reach the place where the treasure was supposedly hidden. I hadn't expected to carry such an important key to the mystery of this place. Perhaps my father knew more than I could have ever imagined. My uncles and I discussed our next steps and decided to prepare for the journey. The next day, Mew brought 5 warriors from his tribe. They were armed with spears and looked stern, with stony faces devoid of emotion. Mew said they would accompany us and show us the way. We thanked him and said our goodbyes, preparing for the journey ahead. The first day of travel passed quietly. The forest was dark and gloomy, but it held no obvious dangers. We walked among tall trees, their roots clawing at the ground like the talons of giants. The Luna warriors moved silently, like shadows, without uttering a word. Uncle Fred occasionally glanced at us, as if checking that everything was all right, but no one spoke. That night, we camped in a small clearing, lit a fire, and after setting up our belongings, tried to sleep. But on the second day, everything changed. The forest grew denser, and the air became heavy, as if foretelling doom. We walked in silence, feeling the tension building. Suddenly, a creature appeared from the mist that clung to the ground. It looked like a giant centipede, at least 10 feet long, with a shiny chitinous shell and horrifying tentacles writhing in the air. Its eyes were empty, black voids, and a foul stench of decay emanated from it. The creature lunged at us with incredible speed, as if it wanted to tear us apart. Uncle Fred drew his pistol and fired, but the bullets merely ricocheted off its armored shell. I unsheathed my sword, knowing that steel would do little against this monster. The loony warriors didn't hesitate. They surrounded the creature and hurled their spears. The sharp tips pierced its body, but it kept moving, writhing and trying to grab us with its tentacles. The battle was fierce. We all attacked together, aiming for its weak spots. I struck at a soft segment between its plates, and black blood splattered onto the ground. The Luna warriors expertly threw their spears, one after another, until finally, one of them pierced the creature's head, striking directly into its black eye. The monster shuddered, letting out a piercing shriek before collapsing to the ground, still writhing in its death throes. When it finally lay still, we stood there, breathing heavily, surrounded by the eerie silence of the forest. We continued on our way, carefully avoiding dangerous areas the loony warriors warned us about. The forest grew darker and denser, but with each step, we drew closer to our goal. Finally, after several hours of tense travel, we reached a lake. The warriors stopped and pointed to it, telling us we had arrived. We thanked them for their help, and they silently turned and disappeared back into the forest, leaving us alone. The lake was strange, ominous. Its waters gleamed like black oil, and a suffocating silence hung in the air. I decided to climb a tree to get a better view. From above, I could see the lake clearly, and I immediately realized that this was the landmark Mew had mentioned. The lake did indeed resemble a skull. 2 small islands in its center looked like empty eye sockets. The stillness and unease of this place stirred a deep sense of foreboding within me. We began to circle the lake, carefully scanning our surroundings. The water was black and thick, as if darkness itself was hiding beneath the surface. Occasionally something would float up from the depths, indistinct shapes, slick and formless, that would quickly sink back into the murk. These movements filled us with cold fear, and we kept our distance from the shore. We needed to head north, though we didn't know how long the journey would take. The forest around us seemed endless, but we pressed on, each day pushing through thick underbrush, skirting treacherous swamps, and dodging carnivorous plants that tried to snatch at our legs. A week passed in a blur. Time lost all meaning, and each day blended into the next. But finally, on the 8th day, we emerged into a clearing and saw before us a ruined temple. Its black stone walls were covered in moss and cracks, as if the temple had endured thousands of years of neglect. The air was thick with the smell of rot and ancient decay, and it felt as if the forest itself trembled before this place. But the most terrifying sight wasn't the temple itself. Surrounding it were the beings Joe had spoken of. These alien creatures, with their advanced technology, seemed out of place in our world. Their tall, slender figures were clad in strange, silvery armor that shimmered in the dim light. Their heads were elongated, with large black eyes devoid of pupils. They made no sound, silently gliding around the temple as if waiting for something. Attached to their arms were devices that resembled weapons, but far more advanced than anything I had ever seen. The creatures moved with mechanical precision, their movements smooth and flawless. It seemed they communicated with one another without words, perhaps through telepathy or some other unknown means. Remembering that Joe had mentioned their benevolence, I decided to approach them, despite my fear and doubts. When they saw us, their formation wavered slightly. It was an unexpected sight, as if they hadn't anticipated that anyone else might arrive in this place. Soon, one of them, apparently the leader, stepped forward. Its figure was slightly taller and more imposing than the others, and its armor gleamed with a silvery light. It stopped in front of us and attempted to speak, but I couldn't understand its words. Once again, Ed came to the rescue. A telepathic connection was established and we began to communicate. The creature was surprised that we could converse in this way. It asked what we were doing here. I explained that I was searching for my father and showed them the map we had found. It pondered for a moment, then responded that my father and their elders had entered this temple several years ago and had not returned. This news stunned me, and I immediately asked why they hadn't investigated what had happened. The creature shook its head and explained that they were unable to pass through the barrier guarding the temple. They didn't know the key needed to unlock it, and their elder had left no instructions. As a result, they were forced to remain here, guarding the temple and waiting for someone who could enter. I asked if I could try to pass through the barrier. After a pause, the creature nodded and led us to the temple. We approached the massive stone doors, covered in ancient carvings. The doors creaked open with a low groan, and we were met by cold, stale air that seemed to have been undisturbed for centuries. We stepped inside, feeling the darkness envelop us, as if welcoming long-forgotten guests. Inside, the temple was vast, with towering columns reaching up to the ceiling. The walls were covered in strange bas-reliefs depicting scenes I couldn't decipher. Human-like figures battling shadowy monsters. The light from our torches cast ghostly shadows, which danced across the carvings, bringing them to life in the flickering glow. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of our footsteps echoing through the halls. We slowly moved forward until we encountered a staircase leading down. The stone steps were slick and steep, as if long forgotten. We descended into the basement, where we were met by a shimmering silver barrier. It flickered and rippled like liquid metal, blocking our path. Before the barrier stood a pedestal, upon which rested a stone wheel, carved with a craftsmanship that would make ancient artisans envious. Symbols were engraved on the wheel, some of which I recognized. I opened my father's journal and flipped through it until I found the page with notes resembling these symbols. It was a clue, the key to solving this puzzle. I carefully began to turn the wheel, aligning the symbols in the correct sequence. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, the tension building with each click. Finally, when the last rune fell into place, a melodious, pure tone resonated through the chamber, like a hand brushing across a harp string. The silver barrier trembled and began to dissolve, revealing the way forward. We exchanged glances with my uncles and the creature standing beside us. In their eyes, I saw the same mix of anxiety and hope that I felt. We stepped forward, through the opening that had appeared in the barrier. We found ourselves in a vast cavern, our footsteps echoing in the space. The walls, covered in damp moss, reflected a faint glow emanating from the depths. At the far end of the cavern, a passage stretched deeper into the rock. Its darkness was both inviting and terrifying. We slowly advanced, and after a few steps realized we had entered a labyrinth. This stone labyrinth was like something out of a nightmare. Narrow corridors twisted like serpents, forming unnatural angles and dead ends. The walls were cold to the touch, and it felt as if they were moving, whispering in an unknown language. The passage suddenly split into 3 branches, and I stopped, trying to decide which way to go. Glancing at the ground, I noticed faint tracks leading to the left. I pointed them out to my companions, and we decided to follow them. We walked down the narrow corridor, and the tension in the air grew thicker with each step. The labyrinth was ominous, and with every minute, it felt as if it was trying to confuse us and lure us into a trap. But suddenly, a strange anomaly appeared ahead. It was a glowing cloud filled with electric discharges spiraling and flashing like lightning in a stormy sky. We froze when we saw 3 figures suspended inside the cloud. The strangest part was that they flickered in and out of existence, as if their being was tied to fluctuations in time. Among the figures, I recognized my father, and beside him were 2 aliens. My heart stopped when I realized they were still alive but trapped in this temporal snare. In a panic, I began searching for a way to free them, frantically scanning the walls and floor for any clue. Then I noticed a lever hidden around a corner, almost invisible in the dim light. I pulled it with all my strength, and the cloud vanished instantly, as if it had never been there. The 3 captives collapsed to the ground, their bodies falling like marionettes with cut strings. We rushed to them, and I helped my father to his feet. He rubbed his eyes, holding his head as he tried to focus his gaze. When his eyes finally met mine, he recognized me and said in a weak, trembling voice, "Michael, you actually came." Then he hugged me tightly, and I felt his tears soaking into my clothes. These were tears of relief, pain, and long-awaited reunion. Uncle Fred and Uncle Bill approached us, and when my father saw them, he couldn't hold back his emotions. My father looked at me, wiping his eyes once more, and said, "You've grown so much, Michael. I'm sorry I was gone for so long. I was a terrible father." His voice trembled, and he hugged me again as if afraid I would disappear. We waited while my father fully regained his senses. Inside, I felt a whirlwind of emotions, a mix of joy and fear, but most of all, relief that he was alive. When he had calmed down, I asked him the most important question. "What did you learn, Dad?" Father settled himself against the cold wall, his voice quiet but heavy with the weight of his experiences. "When I first started exploring this zone, I immediately felt that something was wrong," he began, his gaze distant. "The first thing that struck me was the chaotic nature of everything around me. The diversity of creatures and plants was unnatural. In a normal ecosystem, there's always a food chain, where one being supports the life of another. But here, everything was broken, as if these creatures didn't belong to the same world. The further I ventured into the zone, the more apparent this anomaly became." He paused for a moment, as if recalling how he had entered the red zone and encountered new races and beings. "When I met the Gruuls, they told me the truth," he continued. "This world isn't just an anomaly, it's a fusion of different worlds and dimensions, brought together by a single entity. This entity travels through universes, devouring them and leaving only remnants. This tree, actually a parasitic fungus, spreads its spores through a meteorite that travels between worlds, connecting them into one dimension, where the mother tree resides. This tree feeds on the souls of living beings from all the worlds it has consumed. It doesn't destroy them immediately, but slowly, step by step, drains them of life until nothing is left." His words hung in the air, filling us with dread and a grim understanding. Father continued, "That's why there are so many different creatures and races here. They're all victims of this monstrosity, trapped in a world that's consuming them. This tree is something that cannot be stopped. Even highly advanced civilizations have been consumed by it, like the Gruuls, who are 1,000 years ahead of us in technology. Their world was completely absorbed, and the same fate awaits Earth." He lowered his head, his voice growing even quieter. When I realized this, I was shaken to the core. All those doomsday prophecies, the pessimists who spoke of the end of the world, they were right. This zone brings apocalypse. That's when I started searching for hope, some way to survive. I learned about the existence of a treasure, an artifact that could destroy this parasitic fungus. For a long time, with the help of the ghouls, I explored ruins, gathered information, and spoke with representatives of various races living in this world. There are thousands of them here. Eventually, I found a member of an ancient race, the last of his kind. He told me about the treasure hidden by his ancestors. Father looked at me, his eyes shining with memories. We searched for this temple for a long time, but as you can see, we got caught in a trap. It was a strange one. We seemed to be shifting through time and space, suspended in a void, in a place that didn't exist. That's when I managed to send you the journal. I knew you would come for me, that you would save me. Finishing his story, Father looked around as if assessing our surroundings, then said resolutely, "We need to keep moving. Time is not on our side." His voice held not only confidence, but also the understanding that any delay could be fatal. We pressed on, delving further into the labyrinth. This time, Father was extremely cautious. His steps were slow and deliberate as he carefully examined every corner and crack in the stone walls. The labyrinth was far from simple. The narrow passages twisted and turned, the walls adorned with strange patterns that seemed to move in the dim light of our torches. It felt as if the very stone was alive, breathing and watching us. We wandered through this stone nightmare, trying to stay close to one another. The corridors would narrow, becoming tight slits we could barely squeeze through, then suddenly expand into vast chambers where the echoes of our footsteps reverberated off the walls, bouncing into the labyrinth's depths. At times, it felt as if we were walking in circles, returning to the same spot. But Father, consulting his journal and the marks etched on the walls, guided us forward. Finally, after what felt like hours of wandering, we emerged into a hall flanked by massive statues. These were beings of an unknown race, with 6 arms and frozen in prayer. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes closed, heads bowed to some unseen object they worshipped. We passed by them, feeling a cold fear crawl down our spines. The statues were so lifelike that it seemed they might spring to life and attack us. But they remained motionless, with only our shadows flickering across their faces, giving them a haunting appearance. We moved past this hall and found ourselves before massive doors that groaned open before us. Beyond them lay a vast chamber, so immense that its ceiling was lost in darkness. In the center of the room sat a colossal skeleton, 2 stories tall. Its body was crossed in a lotus position, and a single empty eye socket stared into the void. It seemed frozen in eternal meditation or anticipation, as if its life had been cut short at a crucial moment. The skeleton's bones were massive, as though it had once been a god, long forgotten and left here to die. Deep cracks marred its skull, as if someone had tried to break into its mind but failed. Its pose was calm, but within that calmness lay a threat, as though the skeleton awaited someone to disturb its rest. We stood before the giant, and the hall was filled with a deep, oppressive silence. Father stepped forward cautiously, and we followed. Each of our steps echoed in the vast chamber, and with each step the silence grew heavier. The skeleton's eyes, though dead and empty, seemed alive, watching us, judging our courage or foolishness. As we approached, something at the base of the skeleton caught our attention. We moved closer and saw that it was a cocoon, marked with the symbol of the letter Y. Inside, through the translucent walls, we could see a creature resembling a larva. I turned to Father, surprised, and asked, "Is this the weapon?" Father stood in thought, his gaze focused and intense. Then his face lit up with sudden realization, and he turned to us saying, "Perhaps it's a parasite that will consume the parasite." We exchanged glances, recognizing the brilliance of the idea. But just as I touched the cocoon, the skeleton suddenly came to life. Its empty eye socket flared with a sinister light, and a beam of bright light shot through us, scanning every cell of our bodies. When the beam passed through the ghouls, it abruptly turned red, as if it had detected something foreign and hostile. The ghouls grew visibly nervous, their faces twisted with fear. Father, sensing danger, turned to them and asked what was wrong. But they barely managed to stammer out something unintelligible before shadows began to materialize in the chamber. The shadows were alive. They emerged from the very air, slid along the stone walls, and descended upon the ghouls with terrifying speed. These were shapes of beings that didn't belong to our world, their silhouettes distorted as if from a nightmare, and they moved with an unnatural swiftness. The ghouls screamed, but their voices quickly turned to gasps as the shadows engulfed them, tearing them apart. It seemed the shadows weren't just killing them, they were consuming their very essence. My father, horrified, turned to the skeleton's skull and shouted, his voice breaking, "Why did you do this?" But his only answer was another beam of light that passed through us, and a vision flashed in our minds, clear as day. We saw the truth. The ghouls had been traitors, working for the parasite. The revelation hit us like a bolt of lightning. Father, stunned, sank to his knees, trying to comprehend the cruelty and deception of this world. We had been so close to victory. So why had they turned against us? Father muttered to himself, unable to accept the betrayal. When the shadows had finished their gruesome work, silence returned to the hall. We gathered around the cocoon, examining it, searching for clues. "Maybe we need to cut it open," Uncle Bill suggested, but we dismissed the idea, knowing that it might kill the larva inside. Father once again addressed the skeleton, but it remained as silent as before. We were at an impasse, unsure of what to do next. Suddenly, Ed, who had been sitting on my shoulder, jumped down and began circling the cocoon as if listening to it. Then I felt a telepathic signal in my mind. "I've made contact with the larva," Ed said. "It told me we need to take it to the mother pool." Surprised, I asked, "What is this pool?" Ed replied, "It knows the way. Take it with you." So we did. The larva was small, and I carefully placed it in my backpack. Now we faced the challenge of escaping the hall, knowing that the traitorous ghouls were waiting for us at the entrance. We stood in confusion, pondering our next move. But then something unexpected happened. The floor beneath us began to tremble, and from a dusty stone slab rose a stone chest. We exchanged disbelieving glances. Father cautiously approached the chest, and with some effort, opened it. Inside lay a horn, strange, ancient, covered with carvings that depicted battle scenes and symbols unfamiliar to us. We all froze, unsure of what it meant. "What is this?" I asked, but no one had an answer. Father took the horn in his hands, feeling its weight. He wasn't sure what it was, but his intuition told him it was important. We decided to take it with us, realizing it might be key to our survival. As if in response to our decision, a soft, creaking sound echoed from the back of the hall. We turned and saw a hidden passage opening before us. The stone walls parted, revealing a narrow corridor leading into the unknown. Without wasting time, we rushed toward it, understanding that this was our only chance at escape. The corridor was long and winding, but we didn't stop, moving forward in hopes of finding an exit. After a few minutes, the light ahead grew brighter, and finally we emerged into the open. Before us stretched a dark, dense forest, full of life and fresh air. We paused for a moment, realizing that we had managed to escape, but there was no time to relax. We knew that the ghouls could realize our disappearance at any moment and begin scouring the forest. So we quickened our pace, trying to put as much distance between ourselves and the temple as possible. The trees around us grew thicker, their shadows hiding us, but the fear of pursuit drove us forward. After some time, almost as if responding to some intuitive signal, the ghouls realized we were gone. Perhaps they had a sensor that detected the death of their leaders. We heard their angry cries echoing through the forest in the distance. We tried to move silently, avoiding dry branches and fallen leaves that might give away our location. At one point, we heard the ghouls pass nearby, close enough that we could hear their breathing and the rustle of grass beneath their feet. Father gestured for us to stop and stay hidden, and we froze, holding our breath. The ghouls continued onward, unaware of our presence. We waited until their footsteps faded into the distance before cautiously resuming our journey, moving even faster now. The forest seemed endless, but we knew that only speed and caution would save us. After several hours, just as we were beginning to tire, the pursuit finally ceased. We emerged into a small clearing, exhausted, but alive. Suddenly, Ed began to emit strange sounds, a melodious, drawn-out howl that echoed through the forest. My heart raced, fear tightening its grip on me. I was afraid that this sound would attract our enemies, that the ghouls would hear it and come charging toward us. But before I could fully grasp my fears, huge cats emerged from the shadows of the trees. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, and their massive paws moved silently across the ground, as if they were part of the forest itself. These cats were majestic creatures with long, muscular bodies and thick fur that shimmered silver in the moonlight. They approached silently, and one of them slowly knelt on its front legs, as if inviting us to climb onto its back. Father, without hesitation, mounted one of the cats, and my uncles and I followed suit. Ed returned to my shoulder. The cats took off, and the forest around us became a blur of shadows. We sped forward, guided by Ed's directions. The speed was incredible. Trees, bushes, and rocks flew past us, barely visible in the moonlight. Occasionally, monsters would emerge from the depths of the forest, growling and roaring, but the cats easily outmaneuvered them, moving like shadows slipping away from the light. We felt like part of this wild world, gliding over the ground on the backs of these amazing creatures. From time to time, ghouls flew overhead, their figures barely visible in the sky, but we knew they were searching for us. The cats led us through thick underbrush, avoiding open spaces, hiding us from the eyes of the traders. Night fell over the forest and the darkness deepened, but the cats didn't stop. Their movements were swift and precise, and we could sense that they knew where they were going. Ed occasionally sent telepathic signals guiding our path. By morning, as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the canopy, we found ourselves before something extraordinary. A massive tree towered over the forest, its gigantic trunk covered in growths that resembled coral or giant fungi. Its branches twisted and intertwined like living things, and its bark appeared diseased, as if afflicted by an ancient blight. The tree seemed both dead and alive, its presence inspiring both fear and awe. This was the parasite that devoured worlds, I thought to myself. We slowly approached the tree, or was it a fungus? I couldn't tell. At its base lay a pool. Its waters were dark and ominous, shot through with a greenish light that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the earth. Strange creatures wandered around the pool as if guarding it. These beings were a grotesque fusion of plant and animal traits. Their bodies, resembling thick plant stems, were covered in rough bark-like skin. Large leaves grew from their backs and shoulders, rustling and hissing at the slightest movement. These creatures had no eyes, only smooth, faceless heads elongated into cones that resembled corn cobs. Instead of faces, they had several vertical slits from which a misty light emerged. Their arms and legs were thin and flexible, ending in claws like those of predators, capable of piercing earth or stone. They moved slowly, emitting a barely audible rustling sound like metal scraping against stone. Alongside them stood ghouls, tall, slender, with pale, metallic-looking skin and cold, empty black eyes. They were armed and alert, their figures trembling in the light like mirages. The ghouls seemed to sense our approach, their movements tense, their weapons ready for battle. As I realized the path to the pool was blocked, I turned to my father, desperately asking, "What are we going to do now?" He paused, deep in thought, then silently pulled out the horn, the same one we had found in the stone chest. His face twisted with determination as he blew into it with all his might. A loud, resonating sound erupted from the horn, so powerful it seemed to tear the very air apart. The sound echoed through the forest, bouncing off the trees, rocks, and water. It felt as though it reached every corner of this sinister world. The sound was ancient, primal. It sent shivers down my spine, stirring something deep and forgotten within me. The cats we rode tensed up, their bodies coiled with anticipation, their eyes gleaming with the promise of battle. We moved around, continuing to blow the horn, drawing some of the ghouls toward us, only to quickly evade them. This went on for hours. I began to think nothing would work. But then, as if in response to the call, the forest came alive. From all directions, out of the shadows of the trees, emerged creatures, hundreds, thousands of beings from the various races we had encountered in this strange place. They were of different shapes and sizes, with varying features, but they all moved in the same direction, merging into a single force, like a mighty river rushing toward its goal. These creatures seemed to have been waiting for this call their entire lives. It was encoded in their genes, an ancient signal that had only now been activated. They charged at the guardians of the pool. The ghouls and the pool's sentinels met them with ferocity, but the onslaught was overwhelming. The sentinels, those faceless beings covered in rough bark, devoid of eyes, spewed toxic thorns and poison in an attempt to halt the advancing horde. The ghouls, armed to the teeth, unleashed laser beams and hurled energy blasts, but their lines quickly crumbled under the relentless assault. Suddenly, the ground beneath us trembled. From it emerged spores, the same deadly spores that consumed everything in their path each month. They rose into the air, swirling like smoke, attacking all living things in their way. But even these lethal clouds couldn't stop the tide. Creatures died in the horrific mist, their bodies writhing in agony, but there were too many of them. The spores couldn't kill them all, and the battle raged on. We fought our way through this hell, driven toward the pool. All around us the battle raged, chaos filling every inch of space. I recognized familiar faces among the attackers, those we had met on our journey through the zone. Even the butcher, that giant warrior in a gas mask, appeared in my sight, riding a monstrous creature that resembled a boar with scaly skin and blood-red eyes. His face was twisted with bestial fury, and the axe he wielded tore through enemies with savage force. It felt as if the whole world was shaking from this battle. The spores, swirling in the air, consumed the creatures, but the onslaught didn't waver. The beings who answered the horn's call broke through the defenses of the sentinels and ghouls, driving them back toward the pool. We, in the midst of this madness, pushed forward, our hearts pounding in our chests. We broke through the chaos of the battle, rapidly closing in on the pool. It seemed that our goal was within reach, but suddenly, the ground before us erupted. A tendril, thick, writhing like a serpent and covered in thorns, shot up, attacking us with incredible speed, trying to block our path. Its movements were lightning fast, and it seemed to possess a malevolent will, intent on our destruction. I drew my sword and we charged at the monstrous tendril. The blade slashed into its flesh, tearing chunks away, but each time we struck, the tendril only grew more furious, its thorns lengthening and trying to impale us. The cats we rode also leaped into the fray, their claws and fangs ripping into the creature, but it continued to fight, writhing and attempting to encircle us. At one point I felt our strength waning, and I feared this might be our final battle. But then, a loud explosion rang out, and the tendril suddenly burst apart. I turned to see Joe, riding a creature that resembled a giant lizard with scaly skin and glowing eyes. In his hands was a smoking grenade launcher, freshly fired. Joe waved at us with a grin. Without wasting time, he pulled out a bow and began shooting, covering us from the enemies that continued to close in. We finally reached the pool. I rushed to the water and, opening my backpack, pulled out the larva. It was small and looked vulnerable, but when I dropped it into the pool, everything changed. The larva fell into the water, or rather into a thick, viscous liquid that resembled gelatin. The larva began to consume the liquid with insatiable greed, its body pulsating, and before my eyes it started to divide and multiply. The tree, that ancient, malevolent entity, seemed to sense the threat. It began to shake, its branches rustling as if trying to tear itself from the ground to flee. But it was too late. The larvae continued to multiply at a furious pace, covering the entire surface of the pool, then burrowing into the earth, digging toward the tree's roots. The ground quaked beneath our feet as the larvae, like sharp spears, began devouring the tree's roots. The larvae, like relentless predators, began to devour the tree, crawling up its trunk toward the crown. With each passing second, their numbers grew, swarming over the ancient tree like an army of ravenous insects. The tree began to emit sounds, horrifying, piercing screams that were not just noise. These were the cries of thousands, if not millions, of beings consumed by this evil over centuries. The screams penetrated us to our very bones, freezing the blood in our veins. It felt as if each cry was an echo of the pain, suffering, and despair of the souls devoured by this monstrous tree. The crown was the first to disintegrate. Branches snapped with a terrible crack, shedding rotten leaves that crumbled into dust the moment they touched the ground. The larvae continued their work, consuming the tree from within, and it started to shake and writhe as if it were a living entity in its death throes. The ground beneath us trembled, and the air was filled with the stench of decay and rot. With each passing moment, The larvae destroyed everything alive around them faster and faster, until finally, the tree collapsed. It fell with a deafening crash, like a colossal dying beast letting out one last scream before death. The entire forest shuddered from the impact, and then there was silence, like the calm before a storm. Suddenly, a bright flash of light erupted. It consumed everything: trees, earth, sky. I shut my eyes, shielding them from the blinding light, and felt it seep into every cell of my body. The light seemed to cleanse everything around us, destroying the darkness that had hidden this world for centuries. Then, just as abruptly, the light vanished, leaving behind a profound silence. I opened my eyes and looked around. We were all safe. The forest, which had recently been a battlefield, now looked dead but peaceful. The creatures that had fought alongside us seemed to be recovering. I saw the sentient beings who survived this nightmare begin to cheer, jump, and embrace each other. Even the monsters that had been our enemies now appeared calm. They slowly dispersed into the forest, as if they knew their time here had ended. A deep sense of relief, joy, and gratitude washed over me. We did it. We won. We all embraced, laughed, and shouted with joy, feeling the weight that had burdened our hearts finally lift. Even Ed seemed content, sitting on my shoulder, purring quietly. When the excitement subsided, we gathered the remaining people and, mounting our loyal cats, headed toward the edge of the zone. The forest now felt serene, quiet, with no trace of the terror we had endured. As we looked back, I saw that where the tree had stood, there was now a deep crater. It was the place where the monstrous tree, which had devoured worlds, once stood. Now, only emptiness remained, as if the forest itself was trying to forget its existence. When we reached the boundary of the red zone, my heart skipped a beat. I feared the barrier would still be impenetrable, locked as it always had been. But Uncle Fred, without hesitation, stepped forward and passed through it freely, as if the barrier no longer existed. This could only mean one thing. Not only could we pass through, but the creatures that inhabited this place could now enter Earth as well. The implications of this discovery for humanity were too terrifying to contemplate. I tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing on the present. Joe, who was walking beside me, stopped and looked back at the forest, as if pondering something important. Then he turned to me and said, "I'm going to stay here, to find everyone still lost in this zone, and help them return. Someone has to take care of these people." His voice was firm, and I knew he had already made up his mind. As we said our goodbyes, Joe unexpectedly handed me a small chest. Opening it, I found the flower, the very one we had come to this dangerous and dark forest to find. Its petals glowed with a soft, calming light, and it was truly beautiful. Joe smiled and said, "You earned it. Thank you for everything you've done. I couldn't have done this without you." We hugged, knowing this might be our last meeting. I thanked the cats that had served us faithfully on this perilous journey and left Ed with them. Ed seemed to feel that his place was now here, and he silently jumped onto the back of one of the cats, accepting his new role. We crossed the boundary of the red zone and were greeted by a quiet morning. The light of the early sun filtered through the leaves, illuminating the path we walked, leaving behind a world of shadows and horrors. The mist that had clung to the ground slowly dissipated, and with each step, I felt the tension fade, replaced by a strange sense of emptiness. We had walked through hell, but we emerged from it alive,